So we've talked about, sort of informed consent, and it's come up a few times that this is going to be one of our next major projects. When we first thought we would scope it and decide whether we could do anything useful here, we thought that that was a question. As soon as we said that we were interested in doing something on this, it became a thing that we were doing, not a question about whether we were going to do it, because there was such enthusiasm for doing something very, very different. As you know, today's informed consents are long, incomprehensible, a common source of complaints. No one loves them. They serve to inform the participant about the research, but also to protect and limit the liability and exposure of sites and institutions and the sponsor. It's a multi-purposeful document. There have been innumerable efforts to improve it, none of which have been particularly successful. And while we say it's not an informed consent form, it's a process, we know that the form is incredibly important and off-putting, and we don't often monitor the process to know how complete it is and empathetic and all the rest of it, though it's important. And if it's supposed to compensate for the foibles of the document, we don't even know how well that informed consent document discussion proceeds. What we do know is that if you ask participants a couple of weeks later, they don't remember. So that's a problem. And I think, and we all think, that with today's technologies, we should be thinking differently. And when we say we've got a 65-page or a 45-page consent, and somebody says, well, we actually, our consent is only 20 pages, that's because they reduce it to 9-point font, change the margins, and fit it all in a little differently. So, the purpose is to make a free informed consent, values concordant with the participant, and to equip them with the information that whether to enroll or not in a clinical trial. The IC informed consent process, and we would argue the form, should be centered on and tailored to the individual insofar as we can, acknowledging that they're very, very different. And it's a process that should occur not just at the beginning of a clinical research project or trial, but continuously throughout trials so that people have agency to step away or step back or change their efforts. And we've known that this is a problem forever. We've done innumerable, and I've participated in so many projects on informed consent. And we've tried plain language and converting to plain language to short, simple sentences that are formulated differently. We've incorporated input from patients and patient advocates. Executive summaries have been popped on the top of informed consent to make them yet longer. Key information sections have been added to make them yet longer. And when we get to translation, we say, okay, you don't need a 45-page consent. You can do with a paragraph. Because if you speak Spanish, you don't need to know the details. Really? So what we've gotten is the longer, more turgid, more difficult consents. So, I became a convert a quarter of a century ago when I went to the first Harry Potter movie, and I saw the newspaper speaking to the reader. And I was like, that's what we should be doing with informed consent. And my kids say, Mom, you're nuts. We're watching a movie. But I thought this was brilliant to have this. And so the vision here is to make it understandable, fit for purpose, timely, and largely, insofar as we can, uniform, so that we're not recreating the wheel and we're not asking people to understand something incredibly different. So we know the challenges. What are the approaches? And, there's structural changes, there are platform changes, there's alternative elements that we're going to introduce, and there are other changes. That's the way I think about it. Now we're going to talk about AI and focus on alternative elements introduced into the ICF document. Today we're talking about AI-enabled consents, but I want you to just sort of sit back and think about what could be done. First of all, you could design a consent so that participants could choose their own adventure. So you could actually demonstrate what potential risks and/or adverse events look like and present to people what they might anticipate. This rash, for instance, is very different than other kind of skin experiences. You could have avatars to engage, model the informed consent, the research process, and demonstrate the procedures. You could have a discussion between two different people saying, why do I join, why shouldn't I join? And have them argue. You could become an avatar in that if you wanted to participate. And you could model it for different local settings and geographies. And you could do something like really rethink pediatric consent. So why are we sitting there with 20-page PDFs when we have all of this ability? So we could also think about chatbots. Now, I was not a great believer in chatbots and AI, and I was like, my grandmother who used to try and cut the onions faster than the Cuisinart because she didn't want to be replaced. But I, over the last few years, have become a total convert in the power of what we can do if we do it responsibly. The ability today to ingest information and represent information in a controlled way, in a way that is understandable, has never been greater. We could do something that is trained specifically on the protocol, but generally for research. It could be responsive to questions asked rather than anticipating what questions are asked, deliver a certain amount of information, but then let the participant ask further questions for which it may know the answer. And when it doesn't know the answer, instead of hallucinating, because you can tell it not to hallucinate, you can say, that's a good question for your study team. Why don't you ask them? You could enable video demonstrations in the middle of it, of the content and the procedures, embed evaluation of understanding, teach back, so that if they don't get it right, you keep going over it in different ways till people understand. You could deliver a summary of the conversation to the participants with key information so they have something. If they want the whole consent, we could probably arrange that. And you could retain documentation of the conversation so that there's no question that you have or have not delivered the information itself. You have instant translations that are good enough. They may not be perfect, they may not be as nuanced, but they're better than a short form consent. And they're more likely to answer the questions than a translator. And then, it can be a resource for the participants for continuous conversation during the clinical trial. They can go back to it and say, this happened at month 6. How should I think about it? Is it related to the trial? Now, all of that's doable. I know it takes money. I know it takes commitment. I know, it's going to take some ingenuity and for all of us to get over ourselves. But that's why we're here. Because in the end, the participant should be at the center of the work we do. And I'm not saying we should take humans out of the loop. There's a good place for humans, but it may not be in sort of setting up this conversation and having it, or it may be in parts of it. And it's not all or none. There are lots of stepwise ways of getting there. So with that, I want to introduce our panel. So come to the fore, Megan Doerr, Sage Bionetworks, Cristin Freeman from Bristol Myers Squibb, and Mickey Cohen-Wolkowiez from Duke University. And you're going to hear about sort of real visionaries who have done real work in this already to see what is possible.
It's so wonderful to be here. I'm Meg Doerr. I'm the Director of Applied Ethical, Legal, and Social Implications Research at SAGE Bionetworks. SAGE is a nonprofit open science organization based in Seattle, Washington, not related to Sage Publishing or to Sage Fly Fishing or any of the other many Sages that exist. I have been working in the field of informed consent for a long time, undisclosed number of years at this point. We partnered with Apple for the launch of ResearchKit in 2015 and developed an electronic informed consent at that time. I led the development of informed consent for the All of Us research program, which was, again, electronic informed consent process. And now I am working in the field of AI and informed consent. And I think as a person who really thinks about sort of the big picture of informed consent, and I think that, Barbara, this was something that made you laugh. I mean, informed consent is fundamentally, from my perspective, the covenant that we create between researchers and participants, right? It is our foundational relational interaction. And so when we think about that foundational relational activity, the basis of trust, it's really what supports our trust-based interaction with participants, then it can be at sometimes hard to think about how could we bring an electronic interloper into this relationship? Is this not just further distancing us from the actual participants that we seek to serve? And so then you have to really think, as Barbara so beautifully illustrated, about the purposes of informed consent. And in addition to building trust and building relational safety, informed consent is about informing. And that is where we just fail over and over and over again. And so I think that this is where my excitement about AI-enabled informed consent comes from, is because if you have a chatbot that has infinite patience and extensive knowledge, they can sit in conversation, they can adapt their language to the person with whom they're interacting, and provide information at a level and to a level of detail that's appropriate for the audience that they're serving. And then there's still the role of the consent coordinator or the study coordinators to build that relational trust, right? To build up those relationships between people. But the conversation between those two entities, between the patient and the research study coordinator, starts off a little bit more level because there's some information to hold up the feet of the participant. They step into that interaction already knowing something about what they're doing. So this is why I'm an advocate for it, and I'm excited about this conversation.
Thank you.
I'm not an informed consent researcher, so just laying that out there. But I'll tell you a story, and you'll understand why I'm here. So I'm from Venezuela originally. I went to medical school there, and I came to the U.S. to do pediatric training and then pediatric infectious disease training. And when I got to the residency program in Miami, I was responsible for 20 admissions a night. And in residency, there are some dogmas and some Bibles that are given from senior residents to mid-level residents to interns. And one of those, it's called the Harriet Lane Handbook. And so when I saw that, I'm like, this is like the Holy Grail. So everything was in it that I needed to use to treat kids that were hospitalized at this hospital, including a whole section on how to dose kids with drugs for every indication imaginable, down to like babies. And so I would look at the Harriet Lane and I would look at the dosing and I would prescribe it. And then a year into it, I started interacting with people at Duke for fellowship, and they're like, well, go to the Harriet Lane section, to the area where it says the drugs that you need to give, and look at the papers that inform, those dosing recommendations. So then I went back to the literature, 1970s, 1960s, and the recommendations were based on like 2 children. And I'm like, there's no way that everybody in the country is using in pediatric residency programs this Bible, and it's based on 2 children. So long story short, that really sparked in me a desire to do pediatric clinical trials and clinical research. And the reason why this is relevant for this conversation is because we needed to do a lot of innovation in order to be able to do trials in children, particularly trials that needed PK/PD type of information. And so when I got to Duke and my mentor said, we're going to do a trial in a baby that's this big, because we couldn't start with adolescents. We needed to go straight into the neonatal intensive care unit. And they were asking for this much blood. I'm like, well, for one PK sample, I'm like, the baby's gonna die in the trial because we need to collect 24 of these in 24 hours. And so I went to the lab and designed an assay that could test for 6 different drugs in 100 microliters of blood. We created platform protocols so that we can study 50 drugs under a single protocol, 10, 15 years ago. And then we did a lot of training in pharmacology of different faculty to be able to generate regulatory grade data to change labels. And then after all this time, we've changed 20 labels in collaboration with the FDA. And so based on that experience, I've always been very interested in clinical research and clinical trial innovation. And then that has translated into multiple areas at the Duke Clinical Research Institute where I work. And so 2 years ago, we decided to form a center at DCRI called iCube, which is squarely focused on clinical research innovation and finding solutions to clinical research problems. And from an angle of trying to see if there is a commercial application of these solutions, not only an academic interest, but also a commercial application. And one of the first meetings that I had with the new faculty that had come to Duke, Chris Linzel, he was very interested in consent. So he had just recently had an experience of using AI for consent for a medical procedure. And he was saying, why in the world can we use this experience that is being used in clinical care to the consent process in clinical research? And so we started talking about the idea. And then since then, we've recruited AI faculty that has started working on a solution to do consent through a chatbot. And if we pull Barbara's slide that had all the features of the chatbot, what we've done to date is speed up the development of this product using simulation. So you can use different large language models that speak to each other, so you can simulate a lot of these conversations. You can have LLMs that are monitoring all these simulated conversations to pick up, is the other LLM understanding the conversation and picking up and making sure that all the elements of informed consent are being covered. And then ultimately, we're now at a stage where we're ingesting different protocols into the chatbot and doing some human testing. And so I would say that everything that's on Barbara's list, we've addressed except for incorporating videos to date. But we've had the preliminary human testing that we've had has been very encouraging in terms of the interaction that people can have with the chatbot, the lack of linearity in that conversation, because it's giving me information about a CT scan that is going to be done for that study. And I asked, well, what's a CT scan? And it just tells me in plain language what it is. We've played a little bit around different languages, French and Spanish, just to see how quickly that could evolve. And that's not ready for deployment yet, but it's certainly very encouraging. So, we're starting now the human testing, but I again, not being a consent expert, but doing a lot of clinical trials, I can certainly see a lot of applications and how this can expand inclusivity into trials and speed. And so I'll pause there, happy to answer more questions on the tool itself, but that's why I'm here, and I'm actually here representing Chris, who couldn't be here.
Thank you. Cristin.
Hi, Cristin Freeman. I'm representing Bristol Myers Squibb today. So I have a much different background. I spent the first half of my career in academia, where I was a pharmacoepidemiology researcher. And what you might understand about that is it's databases, and we don't consent anyone. So every IRB application was a waiver of informed consent, and that was essentially the first half of my career. While I was at Penn, I did attend graduate school to study research ethics and pivoted into the clinical trial space, where I've spent about a decade specifically focused on informed consent. Initially, when I went to industry, I was in a group at Merck, which was focused on global genomic policy, so it was really niche, and it was a consent team that was focused on the policies that impact how you can use samples from our clinical trials. That role then pivoted me to BMS, where I, over the last 5 years, have grown and have now taken over all of informed consent within the last 2 years. where we're really focused on innovation and streamlining the consent process for our patients. And I have a much different perspective because I'm essentially at the mercy of all of our sites and institutions for what they're willing to accept, what processes, what language. And so the AI projects that we have ongoing at BMS are largely focused on the things that we can independently control. And so that largely includes content generation, assessing documents for restrictions or permission to use data and specimens from our clinical trial. We have generative AI projects that are at all levels of the consent for authoring. So we have quite a few projects that are ongoing related to consent, but the spin is a little bit different, right? I'm not talking about handing an individual participant a device or something that they're interacting with directly, not yet anyway, because I can't independently control that. I need the sites and the institutions and the IRBs and ECs globally who operate in our 50 countries where our global footprint is to be on board with whatever we decide. And so I think the value in groups like MRCT is bringing that information together, making recommendations, and getting those parties on board so that we can say, sure, we'll go along with this recommendation. I'm happy to, and try to get the content aligned for our trials. So I did bring a couple slides today, and it's funny, I was reminded of the MRCT mission when I sat down at the tables today, because on the bottom of the notebook, it says ethical, actionable, and practical. And I have been accused of being practical to a fault. So sometimes I get into these broader discussions, and I bring people down a little bit. Because like ultimately at the end of the day, you need to be able to implement whatever technology you come up with. So one of the problems I see with using artificial intelligence is people talk about it a lot. They talk about AI, what is AI? You're gonna type in a consent question, it's gonna magically give you the answer. That's not really how it works. And so the target of our first AI projects that we're doing at BMS are focused on two main things: on taking our standardized templates, which we did an extensive project to simplify 2 years ago. So talking about page length, we did not mess with the font or the borders of the page. And we got our global template down to 18 pages, down from 42. That's prior to any protocol-specific content being included, but it is the standard text that we apply across all of our trials. So we did an extensive project working with some folks at University of Penn who are focused on ethics to really streamline and reduce that as much as possible. The DocGen tool that we've built in-house is now taking those standardized templates and taking information from our BMS protocols to generate that first draft of the document for the clinical scientists who need to author it. So that's one of the projects that I won't get into too much detail, but we have extensive DocGen authoring happening at BMS. The second one that you see on the screen here is actually around a process that we call informed consent codification. It's a very specialized term. Not everyone calls it the same thing. But it essentially means looking at each IRB or EC-approved document to understand if any of the procedures or research that we've described as a sponsor have been modified via the process of consent negotiation. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. I think everyone here is pretty well familiar with how this goes. And as you work through the different levels of study level documents, country, site, at the end you have one document per site. You might have 10 versions over the course of a trial that may limit what you can do with your data and samples collected on a clinical trial. So the tool that we've built for this, we call it Codex. Everything has to have a flashy name. Codex is an in-house built AI tool that we essentially scan our informed consent documents that are filed in the TMF, the trial master file. So it's the actual document that the patient is signing, not the templates that we've developed. We already know what they say, but what did it look like at the end? And so we had to overcome a lot of hurdles that I won't get into. You can always ask me questions on the break. But because these are in a controlled GCP validated system, we use Vault Clinical, it is difficult to assess these documents with any AI, right? So that was our first major hurdle. But essentially, we've figured it out. And what the tool does is it pulls in the documents. It creates records for each site. It does function more like a large language model than what you're thinking of with Copilot or ChatGPT, where it's generating information for you. This instead is based on parameters that we're defining. So we've classified 32 primary restrictions that we see within our language, and we train the tool to identify the language that's relevant, provide us a SNP, give us an initial classification, and then we have an individual human in the loop with a team of informed consent specialists who review the output from the AI tool and then upload it into our system. And so the font is little here. I think there's one more slide. It's not going to show you much more, but it gives you the layout. When you click on the document, it will link you directly to a document in the TMF. It is integrated in a way that allows you to retain the validity of the system while also actually directly accessing the documents. So I wanted to show just a snip of this is something that is happening now. It is possible. It is not the pie in the sky. Can we hand the Harry Potter newspaper to the patient and have it really tailor the information? But it's baby steps in the right direction at the front end of the process to later enable the back end.
Thank you. So I have a few questions. First of all, you said that you got your essential elements down to 18 pages. So that's the minimum. Mm-hmm. Do you think it can get somehow further condensed, or it's only going to grow from 18 once you put in the necessary research specific?
So with our current interactions with IRBs and ECs and sites, and with the complexity of our trial designs, I don't see it getting any shorter. But remember, consent's downstream of our protocols, right? So Andy was talking about protocol complexity being a huge issue. Most of the time people come to me with problems and they're like, well, what's in the consent? Why is it so hard? And I say, well, have you looked at the protocol for this study? We have to tell people what they're doing. So if you are having a systemic issue, you should check the source, which is the protocol. So I often have to remind people of that because they view consent as a standalone item, but really it's an artifact of the study design.
That's a great comment. And let me ask a couple of other things. So, we've talked about sort of the roadblocks, the barriers to change management. If we gave the 1,400 IRBs, and probably more in the United States, a chat box, that probably just reject it. So what's the roadmap now to getting from using it in company, not necessarily chat box, but AI-enabled consents, to approval? How are we going to do that in a stepwise, inclusive, thoughtful way?
Yeah, so I think we need to remember that IRB, no one at an IRB thinks the state of consent is good. Like, this is not going to be new news to them. There is not a single IRB in the country that's like, what we're doing is fantastic. We love all of this paper. We know it's perfect. So walking into the conversation with an IRB, knowing that they recognize that we need to try to do something better, puts us together on the same team rather than putting us in an adversarial relationship with our IRBs. And so then we need to take, stepwise progression and recognize the things that are going to be red flags for them. Like, obviously one of the main red flags with chatbots is hallucination, right? Like we certainly do not want hallucination happening during a clinical trial. We don't want coercion happening. And I think that this is something that we really need to be attentive to as we think about the use of AI in informed consent. We don't want them giving advice. Medical advice? Yeah, no, definitely not. So really delimiting the space that the AI agent can work in to ensure that we're not placing prospective participants into interactions that are going to take them off the deep end, right? I think that one of the great benefits of an AI chatbot is its infinite patience and its ability to really be persistent in conversation. And so tuning the chatbot to ensure that you're getting something back from the participants. So you're not just having a yes, 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 or a no, no, no. And likewise, that the chatbot isn't dragging out the interaction. I think that those are also tuning points that are going to be really critical to the success of AI, and to being attentive to the concerns of the IRB. So those are some of the key things that I think about when I think about IRB review and approval of AI chatbot projects.
Mickey?
I just want to add a couple of things. I think I need to get forward. So a couple of things, because we've already had some interactions with IRB. So one is, I think Meg touched on this. This is not your, run-of-the-mill ChatGPT chatbot. So these are AI. While the LLMs underneath it may be the same technology, these are AI agents or chatbots with guardrails. And we can very explicitly discuss with IRBs what those guardrails are, so that there aren't, the chatbot is not giving medical advice or et cetera. And so I think the documentation of what the chatbot is and what it isn't is going to be very important for IRBs. The second thing that I'll say in terms of how to work with IRBs is early engagement. So I'm sure people here are familiar with academic institution IRBs and their timelines, and how conservative they can be to new technologies. But we're starting with the Duke IRB. We've had preliminary conversations, and I was very worried when we started meeting with them, because I thought they were going to ask for a script. And as you can imagine, with an LLM, that's, I think, technologically impossible. And they didn't. I think that they wanted more to see the documentation of the conversation and something that the IRB can digest, and how to provide that to the IRB, rather than going back to trying to fit a human process into a new technology. So that was encouraging, and baby steps. And we're also engaging with commercial IRBs, because they have a very different way to operate and different perspectives based on the sponsors that they interact with, to make sure that we can get a more holistic picture of how we're going to navigate this. And I think, back to Cristin's point, just in terms of baby steps, start with one, and then with having one experience. I think if we do something at Duke, then maybe here people are going to say, oh, but they did it at Duke, why can't we do it? And the same goes on and on to other academic institutions. And then the last thing that I'll say is that, at least preliminary, what we've seen is that there are maybe unintended benefits of this technology. So we see that humans start to ask questions of chatbots that they wouldn't ask a human that's performing informed consent. So often these are done by either physicians or coordinators, and the patient may not feel comfortable asking about certain questions or clarifications, whereas with a chatbot, they definitely want to talk about and ask different questions. So, certainly within guardrails, but I think in terms of the adoption and reception, it may be well received by participants.
Yeah, and just to circle back to one of your points, Mickey, around whether an IRB would ask for an entire script. I think if you run into this with an IRB, my recommendation would be we don't have an entire script from the interaction between the participant and the study coordinator right now, right? The informed consent document serves as a starting point. The conversation happens from there. And so in the same way, we're starting from an informed consent document. We're having a conversation. The conversation is entirely grounded within this document. It's not new. Like, this is how informed consent happens already. And so tying this new technology back to our current practice and highlighting the ways that it is similar and grounded in all of the same things, and then addresses some of our principal concerns, our shared principal concerns, I think is my suggestion for a way forward.
Just to be clear, you're starting with an approved informed consent or approved protocol? Which?
So there's different schools of thinking on this. So, for example, when we started with electronic informed consent, e-consent, way back in the day, we still had an approved informed consent document. And then after however many years of practice, we've now gotten to the place where, I had a conversation with OHARP at one point, and they were like, yeah, do you really even need that informed consent document with the electronic informed consent? Are you not documenting it through that process? So I think that there's starting to be some question around whether there needs to be that giant pile of paper associated with informed consent, and would, in fact, having an electronic transcript of your conversation, you being able to search for keywords, actually be the better way of making sure that people could revisit the conversation that they had and the elements of consent. But for where we are with AI consent, we need to start with an approved informed consent and approved protocol. Like, we have to start at ground zero and then build our way up, and maybe we'll get to a place where we don't need the document anymore.
Yeah, and maybe it just starts to look a little bit different. Maybe it's not a fully fleshed out informed consent, but you have your primary elements, your key points, things that you need to ensure that the chatbot hits, right? If you have a minimum set of information that needs to be confirmed. And also, I don't know, I have parents who are aging, and I take them and they immediately get home and forget the conversation, or they want to look at it. They don't want to open a computer. They don't want to be searching. So I think as we think about it across populations, as well as like the capabilities of Dana-Farber are probably much different than a clinic in Western Mass that are going to have a different set of resources. And then globally, right? All of this is extremely US focused. AI right now, it's getting really, really good in English. Chinese and Spanish are right behind. Every other language, it's not an option, right? So not trying to, again, I'm resisting the urge to wet blanket. But it's more of just like being practical
You're
about
a warm blanket, not a wet blanket.
Yeah, but part of the issue is that consent is really subjective. And even when you get into chatbots, I don't know if anyone's using Copilot at work, where we have the advanced Copilot licenses. You can put the same question in, set the source materials, and get two different answers by prompting twice in a row, right? And so when you're talking about consistency, getting the correct information, it is, there's subjectivity even within the AI, which is a hard concept to think about because it's a computer, but it is there. And so you're having the same types of issues that you have. I mean, if I say to Mickey, Barbara has a great consent from Dana-Farber, I really want to use it. Can you use it at Duke? You know what his answer is? Absolutely not. We cannot use it at Duke. And so it's this thing of every IRB has subjectivity. Sometimes it's the sponsor is the problem, right? I don't think that I'm faultless here. Although we are extremely understanding of that and try to work with our sites as much as possible. But it is this, it is interesting to think about the subjectivity within the
and the
AI.
Subjectivity is not a unique feature of the AI, right? The subjectivity is every study coordinator, like regardless of how well they are trained. Like the subjectivity is the congruence of the participant's identity with the study coordinator's identity, or the discordance. I mean, there are so many layers that exist within human interaction that we write off as being not even seen, that suddenly become an issue when we're talking about a computer, and it's not different.
Correct.
Initially I was thinking at the end of the day, so I come from a sponsor as well. At the end of the day, the sponsor delivers a document to the site, but it is the site that performs the process of consenting the patient. I'm curious from Duke's point of view, have you implemented this AI consenting process in sponsored clinical trials? And curious of the feedback that you've gotten from sponsors, kind of number one. Number two, it seems to me that maybe part of the missing puzzle here is the regulatory input on the allowability, right, of using AI as part of the consenting process, and maybe some guidelines from the regulators about how we can implement this. For sponsors, we are looking at ICHE 6. We need to make sure the the site is performing their duties under ICHE 6. And from a documentation perspective, we need to file that IRB EC approved document in our TMF, right? So you have kind of like a competing interests depending on the party, right? That's executing their piece in the process.
Great question.
Yeah, so we haven't solved for, there's a lot of questions that we need to solve for. And so to the first question, we have not tried it in a sponsored clinical trial. And in part, that's because our approach is to start with minimal risk studies and do an evaluation in that context. And then from there, once we get more data on participant experience and some of the logistics that you're discussing, then we would move towards more interventional or other types of more complicated study design. Like oncology is probably going to be our last, frontier. And so this is a stepwise approach. I think about like the Waymo self-driving cars that started at the Michigan fake, city, and then small cities, and then now like 20 different cities. I think that an approach like that is probably going to have to happen here just because of the risks and the operational complications that you're talking about. On the regulatory side, I don't think this is a technical problem. I think the technology is here. I think this is an 80% or more regulatory problem. And so on that front, engaging regulatory agencies is key. We've had a preliminary conversation with the FDA, with the group that Kevin used to lead before. And I think that there is openness and enthusiasm, just like I think there is from IRBs. And so it's just going to take like everything we've done in clinical research, engagement, working through the process. I think that there are solvable problems. I was encouraged in my annual training on, R3 and all that. I saw a lot of not only fit for purpose, like Sarah mentioned before, but other use of technologies to enhance clinical research. So it's not specific, but I think things are coming together where if we work collaboratively, I think that this can happen. And the sponsor voice and, all the processes and, deploying these globally, I mean, there's a lot of, limitations. So having that engagement with you all early is going to be critical too.
William.
Okay, thanks so much for this wonderful discussion. I have the pleasure of looking at all of the online questions at the moment. We have a number of them, and I'm going to try and condense to one kind of two-part question, but if we have time, we can circle back to more. So the first person had asked a question, which was, has anyone had success with implementing more visual and interactive informed consents in an e-consent / kind of remote environment? How did that play out? And I'm going to add on to that. Another question was, how do you sort of gain the trust and build support in for people who don't have facility with these kinds of platforms, like people who are older? So it's sort of a remote and people who may not, want to be able to use these or have the facility.
Yeah, so on the last question, I think that just like in all informed consent processes, there needs to be a variety of approaches, right? You would not have a person who was blind be given printed pages. Like, that would be completely inappropriate. And so making sure that you have multiple modalities so that people can move to the modality that provides them comfort and guidance and information, I think is really key. So at no point would I advocate for there to be a single approach to informed consent. I really think that we need to diversify the modalities of informed consent to meet the needs of our extremely diverse populations.
Yes.
Responding to the question.
Yes.
So there was research done at Duke University. Amy Corneli did a study on comparing text-only consent versus enhanced e-consent, and they found it was about a hypertension study. We found participants that they hadn't all done research. Some had been research participants, and they found that while the comprehension and satisfaction did not change between the two, people felt like they were better informed with the enhanced version, and they felt like somebody cared about them, which was to me the surprising thing. So going back to the connect, like the interloper that you were talking about, in that instance, they thought it worked. So I can send that forward, that research.
That would be great,
then it
and
be
we can
shared.
circulate it.
Yeah, I know a group at Yale did a similar study in pediatric populations and found that certainly among pediatric populations, having an interactive activity was like the coolest thing ever and made it much, much more palatable in that ascent process. Okay.
Okay, I have a practical question. So anybody can answer it in addition to Cristin, who I love the practical approach. We've been talking a lot about the importance of capturing this conversation between the individual and recording that. And this is happening before they have consented. So can you share any of your experiences with sort of pre-consent or actually what they know and understand about interacting with the chatbot and the recording of their conversation and how you manage that, or any thoughts on that?
So I was going to say, over to you, Mickey. I would imagine it's really different for the initial studies that you're doing if they're not sponsor funded, right? Because as an industry sponsor, we don't have permission to collect that data. So in the spirit of baby steps, the internal institutions running these are likely more permissive because the patients are patients at the site, right? And so you're signing your life away in the documentation. Whether or not it explicitly mentions audio or video recordings in your procedural consents and site consents is a different story. But from my perspective, if we were actually to deploy it, you would have to have some sort of permission in advance, I'll say.
Vicky?
Very good question, and I don't know that I have the full answer. So if you think about the technology that we're trying to develop for consent, you can imagine, and I think Barbara mentioned this too, that it could be used for the pre-consent, maybe more pre-screening eligibility assessments right before you get to the actual consent part, and then post-consent, it not only can be used to continue the consent process along the duration of the trial, but it can engage the participant among other things of the study in terms of not only the visits, but if you take it to the extreme, you can start thinking about the technology being used to assess endpoints for clinical trials, if that's a good way to assess endpoints. And so to answer your question directly, we started with consent because we're trying to tackle the hardest problems first because of the regulatory implications. There are now standalone technologies and companies, at least 5 of them, that are working on the pre-consent space, and that's more on pre-screening and eligibility criteria identification, and then they send them like a link to e-consent. But we're looking at this from a holistic perspective, pre, during, and post. But so far, just now starting with consent.
Yeah, and so just to complete the loop here, so obviously recording an entire conversation before somebody's consented is something that would cause alarm bells by a IRB. The justification for doing that is for the purpose of audit. So to ensure that the chatbot has done all the things we're promising it will do and done none of the things we have promised it will not do. And so as a check on quality, the recording can be used for those audit purposes. And so IRBs actually should require, from my perspective, that the entire conversation be recorded so that the conversation can then go through an oversight audit. But to use that conversation for the purposes of research, which is a different thing, would be another study entirely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that if you think of it from the site qualification conversation we were having earlier, like, in my opinion, I actually don't want to be part of that, right? I think as a sponsor, not Cristin, as a sponsor, I think the site should be able to manage, we're going to record you for informed consent purposes and have something more generic that can be used regardless of who the sponsor of the study is, because it wouldn't be turned over to a BMS study until they are signing a BMS consent form. And so I think that as we think about it, I don't know that it needs to be tied into how we consent now and how we structure it now. It's like taking a step back and thinking, like, does that need to be broken up a little bit differently and thought about more as a standard procedure that's not specific to any given study as we incorporate this type of technology?
Right. So if people are more open with a chatbot, just to clue in our online people, it would be important for us to have a record of that. And also, I think from the perspective of the oversight committee, the IRB or ethics committee, it would provide reassurance to them that actually questions that haven't typically been asked before. Will this affect my sexual health? Will this affect my recreational use of drugs or alcohol? Those kinds of things come up really frequently in chat conversations with an AI agent. That actually provides greater evidence of a more thorough informed consent process.
Lisa.
Thank you. I had to write down my questions just to make sure I remembered them. Lisa Lewis, I'm director of Fast Secures Bilkin Institute. Megan and Chris, you touched on some of what I was going to ask, so this may be more of a comment, clouded as a question. I think, and other folks may hold this opinion as well, there's an illusion of objectivity when we're dealing with AI. When someone's talking to a computer, they think that the answers or the responses are unbiased, and we know that's simply not true.
Yes.
The cardinal rule of data is garbage in, garbage out, but also bias in, bias out, barriers in, barriers out, all of that. So can you expand upon how you're addressing that in your work? Not just addressing inclusivity at the user interface at the end of the process, but in terms of how these models are trained, the type of data that's used to train these models, the representativeness or lack thereof of that data, the representativeness or lack thereof of those who are involved in the training of the actual models that are deployed. Because like Cristin, I also had that disease of practicality and implementation and thinking of what's gonna happen when this is let go into the wild. And are we really thinking about representation, inclusiveness across all aspects? If we're talking about accessibility, folks who are neurodivergent, different languages, as you touched upon earlier, what are the considerations on the front end to make sure when these amazing tools are deployed that they're not exacerbating all the things that we know are barriers when we're talking about paper consents being delivered in the clinic?
Well, and you run the risk, right? So let's say we build it so you can input demographics, right? So you're the patient now and you say, I'm Cristin, middle-aged white lady, married, whatever the relevant parameters are, educated. That then, if we're using that as part of how we're triggering the responses, you risk introducing additional bias. And so it's really complicated when you think about the interface of the actual patient, right? When you think about how to overcome that. For the projects I'm doing now, which is not our future looking and the really cool stuff Mickey's doing, what I say about consent is we're actually programming off of the protocol. So any bias that we have actually needs to be focused on how our protocols are authored, right? And so when we talk about our AI bias, we're really focused on our protocol, how that's written. Those are largely still written by humans right now, although we do have some AI tools that are generating some text. They are still human, but also humans have bias, right? So the primary focus when you talk about consent authoring is actually, for me, the protocol, and everything flows downstream.
Okay, so these are two questions online that are interrelated. The first part says, if the trial is federally sponsored or federally regulated, it will be challenging since consent is seen as an inherent role of an investigator. The challenge will be making, basically, is the agentic AI, the agent, the investigator. And then the second question ties in with this and says, would the capture of all the entire consent process from pre to consent to post-consent create an additional regulatory burden for IRBs to have to review whether legally effective informed consent was obtained and maintained? So basically, they're trying to get to who is deciding that, who is responsible that this is legally sufficient informed consent.
Well, I think sort of from a big picture perspective, we are at a tipping point with the responsibilities of an IRB with regards to big data and the use of AI. Like whether we want to hide behind the Belmont report and the common rule or not, it's happening. And group harm and the other downstream negative impacts of large-scale data use and AI use are being felt by communities already, and that impact will only increase. So where we are we're at a place where we need to really think about this. And I think that the ability for AI chatbots in the ideal to not recapitulate the sins of our existing consent processes with regard to bias, with regards to it being sort of a kabuki theater of consent, right? Where there's it's very performative and there's not a lot of information, will require thoughtful and careful oversight. And I think the people who are best suited to that oversight, the people whose original mandate is to look after the interests of patients and participants, I mean, that is the description of the IRB, right? They are not just a regulatory body, no matter how frequently they get put into that position. So I still think the responsibility belongs with the IRB. Yes, I recognize that it's a shift in responsibilities, and I think it's a long time coming. Like, it's about time.
So there was work done at BU probably a decade ago on the use of avatars in discharge instructions. I know that's ancient history now, a decade ago with this world, but the point was it disproportionately benefited people with low health literacy. So people with adequate and proficient health literacy, it was all kind of the same, but people with low health literacy who had potentially discomfort in asking a question, felt comfort in asking, right? And I suspect we would have the same result here with the use of these tools if they're done right and if they're done in the right way. And when I think about, the FDA's mandate to increase U.S. participation, you're only going to get that through reaching people you haven't reached before. Obviously, there's significant implications for representation and for making sure people of all backgrounds are invited to the table and able to participate. People who a long informed consent document may distrust that and not want to be in the trial. I mention all this because the perspective of patients, right? We know people may distrust AI, and I wonder if in the development of these things, we've invited participants to the table, we've invited patients to the table to give their perspective on how to do this in a way that they would find comfortable. So thank you for that. Thank you for the incredible work you're doing and sharing.
Yeah, so if at first, a lot of the questions that are coming through are questions that we're asking ourselves. And again, I think we're at the beginning of this process, and all these, including the bias questions, are going to have to be answered transparently. Yes, we're definitely involving participants. So I see this as, it's the technical aspect of the solutions. There's the evaluation aspect. There's the regulatory aspect. There's the patient aspect. There's the access aspect. So it's a multi-complex problem. And, we know who to engage. Again, we've had initiatives like this before. So as long as we remember to do that, I think it's going to be successful. The other thing that I wanted to mention that sparked on me when you were sharing that is, if we're thinking about more and more prevention interventions of drugs, we're going to have to engage a younger population. And you can imagine what's already happened in 3 years with just the adoption of the regular, run-of-the-mill GPTs. And in 5 or 10 years, if you ask somebody, read this 27-page document, I'm not so sure who is going to want to participate in trials. And we already know less than 5% of people do. So there's something also about this is coming, and we have the opportunity to do it right. And so how can we do that? It's here. It's not coming. It's here. So.
Thank you.
And to your point about the study of avatars, I mean, certainly with the All of Us electronic informed consent, we did a study of 250,000 people who used that consent form, and we saw a huge benefit to people of low literacy, people from rural areas, all sorts of folks, all of these demographics that we think of as being disadvantaged by our informed consent processes showed, if not equivalent, not statistically, they showed non-statistically significantly different performance with the electronic informed consent.
Karen.
Yeah, thank you. Fascinating discussion. I love that we're looking to the forward. And Mickey, great point. I know
my kids would not, my 20 and 30-year-olds were not going to read a 30-page consent. They just won't. They upload it and say, what is this telling me from that perspective? Going back to the recordings and maintaining the chat, I wonder if we need to take a step back and say, do we have to do that long term? Because we're not recording study coordinators consenting. We're not recording investigators consenting. So why are we looking at having to record a different method in that? And then I think about that's a burden that'll go to all of the sites to maintain that. Cloud storage, how long, what's the requirements? So I think that has to get thought through a little bit about what's the best approach.
Yeah, so just to clarify, because I think I was making that point earlier, I think for the purposes of immediate audit in the initial deployment in a study, I think it will be very important for those recordings of conversations to be available for IRB review. But then, because they're not able to be used for research because that's not a research study, it's for quality assurance purposes, then they could be destroyed. Yeah.
But it depends on whether you have a signed consent form at the end,
Correct.
because you have liability if you don't.
Yeah.
So at some point, we need to, sort of close that loop.
Yeah.
And
so
there
the
are other
question-
ways of doing it, but
Yeah, the
just to
question
say.
would be, is there some sort of distillation of that conversation that would then serve as the documentation?
And just to add, I think right now we're thinking about this as an evaluation phase, right? So one thing that's important for us is not to humanize a process that can be much better done with this technology. So one way to understand if the participants is informed is to do a quiz at the end, right? And so, but that's like exactly what we're trying to prevent. And so part of the reason why we're recording the conversations is so that we can analyze from the conversation itself if the participant understood, the different areas that are critical for informed consent, and rather than give a quiz at the end. And that's going to iterate and evolve, but there's a purpose for the evaluation, and then there's going to be maybe something different for implementation.
Go ahead.
Hi, Barbara Steiner from Diabetes Research at Mass General. I'm on the ground consenting people and talking to many, many patients over the years. So I'm going to show my age. And if somebody does not want to be recorded, or they want to, or they don't want to have their conversation recorded, can they opt out? Because I can, and this may pertain mostly to older people, but I could imagine that's another eligibility criteria. Are you willing to have your conversation recorded, this consent process recorded? So just to keep that in mind, that maybe if there were a couple of options for consenting, if people don't want to do it that way. I would also imagine giving people a pre-screen code while they're before they sign the consent, so that can be recorded, but it's not associated with PHI. That's just one thought. And I also wonder who's going to listen to all of these conversations. When you have, we had studies, we have multi-center studies with thousands of people, 200 people enrolling locally. Where is it going to be stored? And oh my God, I can't even imagine trying to listen to this and process all this. I think it's really interesting as part of research, and there might be ways to think about it. But on the ground, I just want to throw all those things out.
Yeah, just to be really, really clear, the only reason that you would maintain a copy of the extensive chat between an AI agent and a prospective participant would be for the purposes of quality assurance, to make sure that the AI agent was doing what it was going to do. This is not a practice that I would advocate for as a blanket policy in all places going forward. So once you know that your AI agent is doing the right things within your particular study, no longer do you need that quality assurance process, just like you would have training for people doing the informed consent process in real life. And then it's not like you are going to be sitting in the room with, and once you have a new hire trained up, you're not going to be sitting with them every single time they consent someone, right? So this is a delimited process for a very specific purpose, not something that would extend.
One thing that I think you mentioned very important is, there's a question about the pitfalls of the relationship between the participant and the study team that often gets developed during the consent process, right? And so if you're now either having a limited human in the loop, or you're replacing that first interaction with a chatbot, then how is the participant then going to know who the study team is? And very important questions that we're asking ourselves, like when does a human come in? How can we do this in a way that preserves that relationship, not only with the PI, but with the study team? And so not easy answers, but certainly something that we're thinking about. I think Diana also had these questions before, like who's missing at this table? I would say, there's community sites, right? So academic institutions, we work in a very particular way that's not real world. And so, community sites that are either in the middle of nowhere or trying to enroll participants outside of an academic institution, I think is very important to have their voice at the table.
Thank you.
So
Go ahead.
my name is Beitash Bahadur. I'm with CISCRP. We're a nonprofit, and we do some of this work to improve informed consent forums with sponsors and patient communities. I have so many thoughts here. I'm excited for the session later. Thank you, folks, for sharing all this. This is the first time I've heard this much thoughtful conversation around this idea. And clearly, given that you folks have a lot more expertise in this than maybe anybody else that I've talked to, I'm going to reduce this to one question and say, do you think that realistically this is something that can be adopted by a majority of industry, including small, mid-size, biotech, and pharma? And if you do, when do you think that might happen? Because again, clearly you folks have much better insight on sort of the resource investment that's here and maybe barriers to entry for anybody who's not the biggest bio or pharma or biotech.
Yeah, so I think that we need to change the perspective on that question, because what we do as a sponsor is set up the sites to enable them to do the informed consent process, right? And really it is those sites, the investigators, the study staff that are responsible for actually executing the process. So to me, it's a bigger conversation. Karina mentioned the regulations that need to be aligned. Regulations are always dragging behind, right? So that's a big piece of it, where people understand that this is now expected because it's here, right? And so now it's expected. The regulations are aligned. The IRBs are getting some sort of support here, right, via regulations, not just in the US, but globally. I feel like this is going to be a nightmare for EU GDPR, for those who work with privacy, especially people talking about recording in Europe. I get nervous. But, it's really a cross collaboration that is not reliant on sponsors. I, as a representing a sponsor, I would be happy to adopt this. I think it's, I have very limited control over this actually getting deployed at the clinical sites.
And it's one of several options potentially
Correct.
for consent.
That's right.
But one of the behind that question is also the question of finances. How much does this cost? How much time does it take? How are we going to do this at scale? And let me end with that question, because we're about out of time, and we'll take it in reverse order.
And who's going to pay for it? Yeah, so I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, Vicky?
I don't have a good answer.
Maybe I'll say something that's a little bit provocative. So the way that we work in iCube is that half of our team is internal to DCRI, and then half are external entrepreneurs in residence that have different levels of expertise. They don't know a lot about clinical research, but they know a lot about commercialization and business. And so as we're talking about this project, they ask, well, who's the buyer? Who's going to pay for this? And how are you going to finance it? And maybe I'll just leave that question out there.
No, that's not okay. That is not okay.
But
what is your answer? And then everybody can live with it.
Yeah. I mean, maybe, and I've learned, again, this is not my area, but I've learned through this process of kind of looking into history and how things have happened before. And, the most important innovation in consent has been going from a paper form to the same form on a PDF that you sign electronically. And when that happened, it was, people were asking very similar questions. How are we going to do this? Where is the paper consent form going to go? How are we going to audit this? How are we going to confirm the identity of the participant? Who's signing it? Is it them? Is it their grandparent? All those same questions. And it happened, and it was funded. There are companies that deliver e-consent, and the industry and sponsors and regulators adopt it. So I think with this new technology, we'll go through something similar. And yes, it will require investment, and hopefully it will be multi-stakeholder investment to see this through, because I think participants would benefit from it, and I think the industry overall would benefit from it.
Thank you.
I agree, but sorry, I have to rebut. So if you say to me, yes, Duke can use it, Dana-Farber is going to use the same exact thing, and so is every community site in Massachusetts. So is every site in all 50 of your countries that you have in this trial. I guarantee you BMS would say, sure, that sounds like something worth funding. Outside of that, it's really difficult. We at Scale do not adopt e-consent because of the pushback from sites. Everyone wants to use their own technology. It's not scalable in a way that is incentivizing for a regulatory sponsor to pay for it. So that to me is the primary driver. If we can get everyone on board, I think funding it will be a lot easy. If you're saying we need to put this on the study sponsor to fund this, that's a lot easier to sell if everyone's agreeing and using the same thing.
It'll also make regulatory change much easier.
Yeah.
Once we understand what the common elements are that everybody needs.
100%. And I think that this, just as a closing remark, it is important to remember what our responsibility is here. And our responsibility is to ensure the informedness of the people who participate in our trials. And if we keep our responsibility clear, then the other pieces fall into place. The need for regulatory change, the need for consensus, the need for funders, it all falls into place because our fundamental ethical, moral responsibility is to the informedness of our patients.
Right. And beyond that, if each of us do it differently, we're going to have more problems than if we can align on how we're doing this together.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.